ABC News presents Political Spirit of '76. This is the final chapter of this bicentennial election year. Tonight from ABC News Election Center in New York, the results. Election night.
Good evening. I'm Harry Reisner at ABC Election Headquarters. With me are Barbara Walters and Howard K. Smith, and we'll be here for as long as it takes to determine exactly what happened tonight. At the moment, in this first election of our third century, about 2% of the nation's precincts have reported, and in the popular vote, with about 1 million or a little bit more than 1 million votes counted, Gerald Ford is leading Jimmy Carter 53% to 47%. That falls into the classification of being interesting but not significant. We do, however, already have some projections. Howard K. Smith can tell us about one.
Well, the first individual state projection we've had, Harry, is Kentucky. Kentucky goes to Jimmy Carter. ABC News projects that Carter will take Kentucky with its 9 electoral votes, thanks to the hard work done by Kentucky's congressional delegation and its governor, Julian Carroll, all Democrats. The interesting feature about that race is that Carter won every group in the state: blacks, whites, Protestants, Catholics, people in cities and people in rural areas. Barbara has a more significant result.
Well, I have a result from Indiana. Indiana, ABC projects, has gone to President Ford. This was expected. It was close, but it was expected that Ford would win this, and had he not won it, it really would have been quite an upset. The blacks in Indiana voted nearly 90% for Jimmy Carter, and it was the biggest turnout of blacks in that state. It was a record number, but still it was not enough to offset President Ford's victory. 13 electoral votes in Indiana for the president.
I think we should take just a quick look only at the people who will be assisting us in major areas tonight. Frank Reynolds will be covering the races for the United States Senate, 33 of them. Don Farmer will be covering all 435 races for the House. He knows all of the men and all of the opponents and will be able to give us anything we need to know at any given moment. And Ann Compton will be following the 14 races for governor. We'll be hearing from them frequently. It should be a fascinating night. And one of the things we should note at the beginning as we picked up that popular vote total, you can't tell much at 7:04 at night about what's going to happen. And one of the things that certainly will happen is that initially, in the first couple of hours, Jimmy Carter will probably have a substantial electoral vote total that will not necessarily mean he's going to win the election, because his votes will come in early from the parts of the South where he's very strong. The first clues will begin to come in a little bit later with states like Connecticut and Ohio. At that point, we'll begin to see how the shape of this year's voting goes. We will be hearing from time to time through the evening from Lewis Harris, who has been keeping track for ABC News of the mood of the country all through this summer. We'll be hearing from Theodore White, who is writing his, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th Making of the President, and is going to give us a preface on it tonight. All of those people will help us find out what is actually going on.
I think people have begun to hear that it's a larger turnout of registered voters than had been expected. At least it seems to be now from some of the returns. And it had been the feeling that this larger turnout would help Jimmy Carter, although there are now others in the other camp who say not necessarily, because it's more Republicans voting as well as more Democrats voting. So don't necessarily take that as a harbinger of what's going to
You had precedents for both, Barbara. When there was a very low turnout in 1948, it hurt the Republicans. Dewey was defeated due to that low turnout. Yet the low turnouts for example, the last election, 72, put Nixon across in the landslide.
Some people say that the turnout is being affected by people's reaction to the media, and I don't mean television, I don't mean just us, I mean the newspapers and everything else, and that they have been told all summer by all the surveys that they were apathetic and weren't going to vote, and they have said something rather strong tonight about whether or not we can tell them what they're going to do.
We don't really want to tell people what they're going to do. I think people don't realize how much we worry about what that effect might be. One other worry was that the fact that some states are coming in that projections are being made might influence voters in polls that have not yet closed, and yet in surveys and examinations and studies in the past, it has turned out that this is not so, that early projections do not influence other voters in other states, which is why you may be hearing projections even though your own polling booths may not have closed yet.
We, next to the presidential race itself, some of the most interesting races are for the Senate 33 Senate seats are up for re-election tonight. Frank Reynolds is keeping track of those, and we already have one important result at least. Frank, could you tell us about it?
Yes, Howard. ABC News now projects, not to anybody's surprise, I guess, that in Indiana, the first incumbent to bite the dust this evening is Vance Hartke, the Democratic senator from Indiana. He will be defeated by Richard Lugar, the former mayor of Indianapolis, by a comfortable margin. Now, Mr. Lugar, Senator-elect Lugar, as he will be when all the votes are counted, is leading by, about 5 or 6 points. 6 points, actually. And that is a few points ahead of the projection for President Ford. So here is Mr. Lugar, who will take Vance Hartke's seat in the Senate. Two other races that we're going to be watching very closely tonight may give us some idea of the pulling power of the top of the ticket. They are in Ohio, where Howard Metzenbaum is in a ding-dong struggle with Senator Robert Taft. This race is considered almost too close to call by any of the pollsters, although the heavy turnout there today is said to be an indication that perhaps Jimmy Carter and Howard Metzenbaum may do very well indeed. The other state we're going to be watching is very, very close and very important, and it is Pennsylvania. The polls will close there in about 50 minutes or so at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. And this is between John Heinz III and Bill Green, both attractive congressmen, Green the Democrat and Heinz the Republican. Heinz probably has spent more money than anybody else this year in American politics. It's estimated that he probably will spend as much as $2 million in his effort to win. I talked to a man in Pennsylvania today who said that the latest word shows Green ahead by 1 percentage point. 1 percentage point. So that really means that they're practically in a dead heat, and we'll have to be watching that to see whether the top of the ticket, Mr. Ford and Governor Carter, have any effect on what happens in that senatorial contest. Well, there are quite a few governor races to be decided tonight, and for a report on that, here's Ann Compton.
Frank, ABC's first projection of the evening is no surprise in Indiana. The incumbent Republican Governor Otis Bowen is projected to win by a comfortable margin. Bowen is expected to defeat the Democratic Secretary of State Larry Conrad, who is a protege of the Democratic senator from the state, Birch 5. Bowen is a popular 58-year-old physician. Some Democrats were even lamenting during the campaign voting against Bowen was like voting against Marcus Welby. Bowen's coattails were expected to help President Ford in the state. And next door in Illinois, President Ford was hoping also to ride the coattails of Big Jim Thompson, the Republican candidate for governor there. Thompson's the 6'6" former prosecutor who's expected to take his $2 million campaign rolling right over Richard Daley's Democratic machine and its candidate, Michael Howlett, who is a state official in Illinois. In West Virginia, it is very likely to be a Democratic state. J. Rockefeller IV, who is making his second run for governor, is expected to overcome the image of a carpetbagger from the Rockefeller family's Northeast base, and his competition is a former governor of West Virginia, Cecil Underwood, who 20 years ago, or about that, was elected governor. No big surprises expected tonight, but then some of these 14 governor's races are very, very close as the presidential returns are expected to be. Howard?
And I have another projection, another state, Georgia. According to ABC News projection, Jimmy Carter will, of course, take Georgia with its 12 electoral votes. Georgia has, in the past few presidential elections, strayed to Goldwater, to Nixon, to Wallace, and now it, like the prodigal son, has come home and given its favorite son the vote. Harry was talking about Richard Lugar winning the most important Senate race so far. Lugar was so confident that he didn't campaign all the time, Frank. He 3 days a week. He taught at the Central College in Indianapolis. Well, the House races are a little more difficult than yours, Frank, and Don Farmer has those, and Don, you're welcome to them. What about them?
Howard, we have a lot of changes expected in the House tonight, but not by party. The Democrats fully expect to retain and maintain their almost 2-to-1 majority. Republicans may pick up 10 or 12 seats. But there will be some changes. For example, the leadership will be different. The Speaker, Carl Albert, is retiring. Tip O'Neill will take over. He's a tough, garrulous, old-style Boston politician. He'll be a tough foe for either president, especially if Mr. Ford's reelected. Other changes may take place because of the personal problems of some of the people involved. I know you've heard all about that. There are stories of divorce and remarriage, which may affect some results. For example, in Indiana, Congressman Andrew Jacobs is the apparent winner, He was not in any serious trouble, but his wife may be. She divorced another man to marry Jacobs not long ago. She's running in Kansas' 2nd District. No returns on her yet. And there'll be other stories of personal problems. Actually, we'll be seeing 435 separate contests tonight, but they have no overriding across-the-board issues. The Democrats are representing their constituents more and their national party less, it seems. And that trend seems assured no matter who wins tonight. So at this moment, to recap, there are 46 Democrats and 6 Republicans elected or apparently elected so far. And that's because none of them have major party opposition. In fact, 30 of them are in races where they couldn't find anybody at all to run against them. So we courageously project them right now as the winners. And that's the look of the House right now.
A postscript to Don's story in Indiana about Martha Keyes, who's running from Indiana. The problem seems to be that some of her people who might vote for her think that since she's married a fellow from Kansas, she's not going to give proper representation to Indiana, but it doesn't seem to work the reverse. His constituents don't seem to be worried about that. There are 19 women in the last House of Representatives lineup. We don't know how many there will be in the future one, but it's not expected that there'll be too much change. Well, what kind of an evening is it going to be? Is it going to be a squeaker or is it going to be a landslide? We hope to get some clues from the man who's been providing clues for many years. Theodore White, the political analyst and author who has written The Making of the President in 60, 64, 68, and 72. How does it look tonight in 76, Teddy?
For the past 20 years, we've had only 2 kinds of election in our country, squeakers or landslides. Kennedy's 60 squeaker followed by 64 Johnson landslide. Nixon's 68 squeaker followed by his 72 landslide. And we can't tell yet tonight whether what we're going to have or whether it breaks the pattern. All we're sure of is the transfer of confirmation of power. But in this campaign, power without any clear, predictable direction. I remember Kennedy saying in 1960, the morning after his election in Hyannisport, the margin is thin, but the responsibility is clear. This time, the direction of this responsibility is not clear. This campaign has revolved around character and personality more than any other in recent American history. And the direction of power is hidden in their character and in their personalities. So whether squeaker or landslide, we face the same mystery of our future with which we began the year.
Thank you, Teddy. Right now, we have got around 1,200,000 votes in nationally. About 2% of the nation's precincts have already reported. Gerald Ford, the incumbent Republican, has a 52 to 47% lead over Jimmy Carter. As yet, I say that's 2%, not representative, not enough for any kinds of conclusions. Coming up next, more of our continuous election coverage right after this. With just a very few votes beginning to come in as this election night begins, it's probably a good time to take a look at the candidates and what they're doing, how they're spending the evening. We'd like to begin by going to Tom Gerald, who is with President Ford's group. Tom?
Harry, there's an ambulance passing up Pennsylvania Avenue, but that's the only excitement going on here tonight. You may hear it in the background. The president is buttoned up, as they say. He's up in the mansion behind me on the 2nd floor in the residence, having dinner with his running mate and with a number of friends who helped out during the campaign. Joe Garagiola, the sportscaster, who added a lot of zest and pepper and interest in the campaign in the latter stages, and Edith Green, the former Democratic Congresswoman from Oregon. They're having a quiet dinner, and then they're going to be following the returns. In fact, they probably already are. So far, the race in Indiana seemed to go as the White House expected. While we were there in Indianapolis a few days ago, one political observer said he thought that Richard Lugar's coattails were broad enough to carry Gerald Ford along with, and that appears to be the case tonight. Mr. Ford will be following the returns, and later tonight, as a trend develops or as we have something more definite, he plans to go and see some of his supporters in a hotel here in Washington. Harry?
We'll be going back to Tom and to look at how the president spends the evening as the hours go by. At the moment, 2% of the precincts in popular vote, something like 1,200,000. Gerald Ford is leading with 52% to Jimmy Carter's 47%. Obviously, as yet, not a significant difference. So far, no surprises, I would think, except the size of the vote. Would you agree, Howard?
No, I thought, for example, that it was generally conceded that Vance Hartke, who has won the Senate in Indiana 3 times, has run out of luck. Each time he's had a lucky streak. First, there was the Eisenhower recession that brought him in. Then there was some big split in the Democratic Party. Then there was Vietnam. And he just ran out of luck, and Mr. Lugar beat him tonight.
In spite of Lugar being once known as Richard Nixon's favorite mayor.
Well, he kind of shed that. He shed it very fast indeed, and he was a good mayor. Now, we've been covering this terrible election year. I say terrible in that it's difficult by intuition and impression and by asking a few people. But Lou Harris has been covering it by measuring it scientifically. Lou, what have you got to say about the results so far?
Howard, what we find here is Kentucky, which is the first state Governor Carter took. It was a little low for him. Indiana was about as expected for President Ford. That could mean the possible pitting of the South and the border states for Carter against the Midwest for Ford, in which case we'll have to wait till we get to the big populist East to see which way this election is going. One thing I would point out is that turnout in Kentucky and Indiana, where a substantial amount of the vote is in, was not higher than 4 years ago. So perhaps we'll find turnout higher elsewhere. We did not in those two Midwest and border states.
Well, we'll have more results coming up next. More of our continuous election coverage right after this.
ABC News is now able to make another state prediction in the state of Alabama with its 9 electoral votes. It will go for Jimmy Carter by a comfortable margin. That, again, is no surprise so far. It does give Mr. Carter now 30 electoral votes to Ford, 13 for Ford in our projections. But that's, again, what was expected, that with the Southeast reporting first, Governor Carter would take an early lead. It is not yet significant. And as Lou Harris said, maybe even the turnout is not all that great, although you had another...
in Massachusetts, it's reported that the turnout today could top the record, which was 91.6% who voted in 1960 for John Kennedy. Very, very high turnout in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has been expected to go for Carter.
One thing that should be, we should also note that if you are in an area where you can still vote, which you could if you were in New York City, for instance, and you certainly could if you were in California or most of the Midwest or the West, if you hadn't voted, go vote. Make some kind of a decision.
We've had several other independent reports on turnout among individual states. Ohio's turnout was very heavy this morning. It's attributed to the massive voter drive by organized labor. Maine, the turnout was heavy throughout the state, and so it is with many other states. Michigan, strong early this morning.
At this point, just to recap, Alabama and Georgia and Kentucky have gone for Carter, and Indiana have, in terms of our projection in Indiana, ABC projects has gone for Ford.
And there are no real surprises in any of those, except that maybe in Kentucky, Governor Carter didn't do as well as he might have hoped he would. Maybe in Alabama he didn't. But, of course, in this system, if you win a state by one vote, you get all of that state's electoral votes, which at the moment gives him 30 to 13. I don't know when we'll begin to see the definitive things. The polls in Connecticut, which are regarded as a place that could be very decisive and very indicative very early, close at 8. All of Connecticut has voting machines. The Democratic National Committee say Connecticut is the most important thing they're going to look at in the first hour. I'd like to go quickly to Frank Reynolds for a note.
Yes, Harry, ABC News is now ready to project the senatorial contest in Florida. As expected, Lawton Chiles, the Democratic incumbent, is the victor by a wide margin. He will be the winner by a wide margin. Lawton Chiles in Florida.
Lawton Chiles, I think, was the man who first won that seat by walking up and down the state. And that's the national election story at 22 minutes after the hour.